Since it's been a while, let's talk about Neptunia Games again. Something there's no denying of is the amount of games there are. It's confusing for newbies or anyone who only played a few of the games. It's not just newcomers though, but also Nep veterans who are getting frustrated with the series. And I think there are a bunch of reasons why that is the case. Today we're going to look at the problems with Neptunia Games. I don't mean technical issues specifically, but more about how the franchise managed to get into its current position. We'll discuss not only game mechanics and graphics, but also the writing, characters, mainline versus spin-off games, and the numerous remakes. And before we really get into it, I'll mention that not all of the developers' moves are necessarily their own fault and needed to be done out of necessity. So keep that in mind as I critique various things. Also, there will be spoilers in like a few sentences, so watch out. I think one of the most important things to realize when it comes to Neptunia is the fact that the staff managed to write themselves into a corner. The true ending in the very first game results in the goddesses becoming human, living a full life, and then passing away of old age. Doesn't exactly present opportunities for sequels, does it? So in order to get around that, the next game, Hyperdimension Neptunia Mark II, ended up being a reboot. And while they were at it, they got rid of that god-awful combat system and replaced it with something very reasonable. The addition of the little sisters was a good thing too, and really upped the character count of the series. The game after that, Victory, was also a lot of fun with the addition of a few more characters that I really enjoyed, like Plutia. The biggest problem was still the first game though. As you can imagine, people who wanted to get into the series figured that the first game was probably the best place to start. But that resulted in a bunch of people being turned off by the gameplay. That was one of the main reasons the Rebirth series was created. That way all three games had the new gameplay, plus they were released on the Vita and PC, which enabled the series to get greater exposure. Also, numbering the games 1, 2, and 3 really reinforced the idea that this is probably where you should start. But that's not the only reason for the remakes. Another reason is the fact that Gust and Nipponichi decided not to take part in the Neptunia project anymore, which resulted in the story having to be rewritten. That brings me to the next point, which is still somewhat related to the whole writing yourself into a corner thing. And that is the reliance on maker characters. Gust and Nisa were main story characters in the PS3 games, so it's kind of jarring to have them removed in the Rebirth games. And those aren't the only characters, of course. The problem of disappearing characters is still going on, as all the DLC characters in V2 are not available for V2R. I do think that V2, and by extension V2R, did go in the right direction with the Gold 3rd characters. They are representations of gaming companies without explicitly using their names, which eliminates licensing issues and therefore leaves the characters available for future use. The next problem Neptunia has is a lack of innovation and even evolution at times. A contributing factor is of course the remakes. I get that the Rebirth games make sense overall. It was a good way to harmonize everything and remove some of the messiness the first PS3 games had. But for longtime fans like me who played the first game when it first came out, the amount of remakes feels a bit much. Since Mark II and Victory, the gameplay has pretty much stayed the same, despite the occasional tweaks or variations. It feels like you're playing the same game over and over again. And that gets pretty frustrating as a loyal fan. For years I've been itching to experience something new, but I had to wait through all the remakes first. The spin-offs scratched that itch a little, but we'll get to those later. The recycled assets were also a real problem. Same music, same dungeons, same graphics. It all just blended together. Thankfully, things really looked up when Mega Dimension Neptunia V2 came out for the PS4 and later the PC. The menus became slicker and nicer to use. The console version was now running mostly at 60 FPS, which enhanced gameplay experience for console gamers quite a bit. The graphics got a nice upgrade over the Rebirth series, and a bunch of new music and new dungeons. Thank God. There's a real sense of refinement across the board. But then we get another remake, V2R. I talked about this in another video, and I think it's a sidestep. Yes, V2R has a new engine, high polygon models, higher resolution textures, new gameplay, and VR mode, but why a remake? I personally don't want to play essentially the same storyline only a couple of years after the release of the original game. Couldn't these new features simply be part of the next game? Then we could have a VR-themed story to go with it instead of the VR mode just being tacked on. Not only is this frustrating to gamers who played V2, it makes things confusing again for newcomers. I thought the Rebirth games were supposed to remove confusion by telling newbies to start with those. Now we've got another remake in the mix, and unlike the Rebirth series, V2R is much more difficult to justify, since it doesn't suffer from the same story and gameplay issues as the first game. And by the way, I don't mean story issues in a negative way. It's more like that it's not very well suited for sequels, that's all. And another thing, the Rebirth games also introduced the series to new systems, the Vita and the PC, while V2R doesn't. It's on the PS4 and PC just like the original. Does that mean every mainline title is going to have a remake that comes out almost immediately after the original? It certainly looks like it because that's the pattern so far. But mainline games are only about half of all the Neptunia games. The spin-offs make things even more confusing. As much as I like almost all of them, they can feel a bit like experiments. Let's throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks. But that's not really a problem for me since that's what spin-offs are good for. It's the naming convention that makes things really difficult to differentiate between spin-offs and mainline titles. Neptunia V or Victory is the third game in the series. V2 looks like a Roman numeral 7, but it actually references the fact that it's the sequel to Victory. Neptunia U isn't on the Wii U. Then you have the tremendously clunky title of Mega Tag Mention Blonde Plus or and Neptune vs. Zombies. Super Dimension Neptune vs. Sega Heartgirls is actually Iffy's spin-off even though the title doesn't have her name, and neither does it take place in the Super Dimension. Oh yeah, let's not forget the dimensions. I will put a card up on the top right. In that video I talk about the different dimensions, but basically the dimensions in the name often don't correspond to which dimension you're in. Which goes right back to the whole writing yourself into a corner thing I talked about in the beginning. It's just a mess. In fact, I have trouble organizing all of these thoughts into a proper script, to be honest. But instead of whining and going on about this stuff, I'll now say what I think Idea Factory could do in the future. First of all, stop with the remakes. I bet with V2R they didn't want to bother writing a new story while at the same time learning to deal with a new game engine, but I think new tech should be accompanied by a new story. That causes less confusion, and it stops people from being disappointed that the new game they were looking forward to is just a revised version of what they played 2 years earlier. Stop using maker characters. It just causes licensing issues. The goddesses are all references to video game manufacturers and consoles without directly taking their name, so other characters don't need to either. I don't want main characters to be retconned out of existence because of licensing issues. Since Neptunia is an Idea Factory property and Compile Heart is one of their subsidiaries, it's almost a sure bet that Iffy and Compa won't be going anywhere. But with everyone else, it's anyone's guess. Evolve the gameplay more. There's been so much recycling of content and gameplay, and I think a lot of people are getting tired of it. That's actually where the spin-offs work great. In fact, Tamsoft have done a lot when it comes to real-time combat Nep games. Neptunia U and Blonde vs. Zombies were interesting, but it's Cyber Dimension Neptunia 4 Goddesses Online that really sets things apart. It seems like it's actually part of the main storyline despite being a spin-off, and it has no recycled dungeons. It feels really fresh, and that's even despite all the bugs it has. Cyber Dimension is like the Neptunia equivalent of Senran Kagura Peach Beach Splash. They both deviate from what's the norm in their series, yet have a mainline game feel to them. I was also going to make suggestions about Neptunia's naming convention, but I don't think there's anything that can be done to make things less confusing here. I will say that despite what I said, I have a thing for word collision titles, and I often enjoy what sort of things they can come up with. Those are my views on the series at the moment. Let me know what you think, whether you agree or disagree, or whether you want to expand on any of the points I made in the video. You can support the channel by simply liking the video if you did. Remember to subscribe if you haven't yet. Also, check out my playlist of Neptunia stuff. I've done a lot of videos over the years about this series. You can also support the channel through Patreon. Depending on the tier, you can watch videos before they come out, and you can even have your name in the end cards. Which there are quite a few of these days, by the way. There's been quite the growth in terms of Patreon supporters, which is amazing. But that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.